Hello, can everybody hear me? Everybody here way in the back? Yonder? Well, here we are again. Another month has come and gone. And this meeting's kind of special. This is our 7th anniversary of the History Club. So in February 2013, we met at a small room in the library. And then the next month, we were here at this place in the little blue room in the back. And it's just been growing ever since. And part of the reason for its growth is the Legion, and the commander here is Dick Dunbar. And Dick's been a friend of mine. We went to high school together, and we were neighbors for years. We used to have good parties out there at Sunrise Estates.
We're not going to talk about those. Anyway, I just wanted to congratulate Mike and this group. Mike and Skip Chambers got it started, and Skip's been a friend of mine also for many, many years, and all my class of 64 guys that have contributed to this. It's been a great relationship for the Legion and the History Club. I hope everybody's enjoying their lunch today. Shondell and Brooke are trying to do a great job of taking care of everybody. I hope they have. And it's awesome to have this group. It's been anywhere from 80 to probably what's the most, Mike? About 110 or 20 probably. So we appreciate their support, and we hope we can keep this going for many, many years. This is one of the reasons that the American Legion exists, not just for the bar and restaurant, but we want to be part of the community. We love having groups like this. We have a lot of groups that meet here weekly, and that's what we're all about. We love anybody that's eligible to join to be a member, and if you are a veteran or you're the son or grandson of a veteran or you're a daughter, we'd love to talk to you about membership. That's the lifeblood of our organization. We have to continue to grow that. We have been the largest American Legion in the state of Indiana for the last 9 years, and we hope that can continue, so we're very proud of that. American Legion celebrated 100th anniversary birthday last year. We're 101 this year, so we hope we can keep it going for many, many years. And with the support of groups like this, we hope we can. And we appreciate your support. That's how we're able to keep this facility alive out here. So thank you very much, and congratulations, Mike, on 7 years.
Thanks a lot, Dick. And now Susan Dyer, the director of the History Center, has a couple of public service announcements to make here.
Thank you, and congratulations to the whole group. We were so inspired by David Nord's talk last month about the grist mills that we have now developed a bus tour to Beck's Mill. So that's coming up on March 14th. Tickets are $55. That includes lunch. We'll also be going to the John Hay Center Museum, and it's nice because it's only about an hour and 15 minutes away. So if you are interested, sign up on the History Center's webpage, which is monroehistory.org. And then we also have the Civil War Roundtable is going to be sponsoring a talk by Christian McWhirter on battle hymns and the power and popularity of music in the Civil War. So that's on Tuesday, March 10th at the History Center at 7 p.m. So I've got flyers for that too if you're interested in that. That one is free. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Susan. Also here today is my beautiful wife, Paulette, right here. My mother, Mary Carter, is always here. And my faithful cousins, Bernie and Nat back there. Glad to see you guys again. And Penny, too, I see there. All right. So glad to see you there. Now, missing today is my Minister of Propaganda, George Carpenter. I don't know how this is going to work, but well, actually, what he does isn't that hard, so come to think of it. So it'll be on YouTube, and he'll see it, that's the cool part of it. Yeah, but thanks to the Legion, as we've already said, for helping us all these years, and Catch TV. They first came here in November 2015, and they're responsible for a lot of our growth. A lot of people get to see these programs that either can't get here during the day because they work or because they live out of state. And you'd be surprised at number of people have told me that they enjoy watching these programs. Be generous with Shondell and Brooke today, our erstwhile waitresses. They do a good job. By the way, how many first-time attendees do we have here? Okay. Now, we have a regular mailing list, and if you want to leave your email address with me, I can give it to George. He's the one that usually takes care of that. And you just get a notification once a month. There's nothing else with it, just to let you know what's going on. Well, and we're booked up for quite a while in the future here. Now we're going to have 2 in March. There's 5 Tuesdays in March, so I decided to try and work an extra one in, especially because I thought this next fellow was pretty special. March 17th, James Lee Hutchinson. He was a radio operator on B-17s in World War II. And he calls this program a World War II bombing mission through the flak and back. He made a lot of runs over Europe during the height of World War II, so that's got to be fascinating. March 31st, Dr. Jake Butler will give a program on the history of transportation in our county. It will cover Native American and early settler paths, water transport, the county's first roads, horse-drawn travel, the rise and fall of the railroad, and the advent of the automobile and the improved road network. April 28th, Dr. Clay Stuckey, who's been here many, many times, one of our great contributors, will give a program on the KKK and the notorious D.C. Stevenson murder trial involving Madge Oberholzer in the 1920s that kind of signaled the downfall of the Klan here in this area, in this state. May 26th, Jeremy Boshears will come back. He's going to reprise his program on covered bridges of Monroe County that he did some time back, but this time with a lot more information and more photos, so it's not the same program. He's found a lot more stuff. June 23rd, Brad Cook of IU Photo Archives will return to show more vintage photos of old Bloomington. That's always a big hit with the group. Brad's been here 4 or 5 times as well. July 28th, Michael White and Adam Stillwell of Catch TV. They're going to come and give their own program about themselves. So they've been around here for about 45 years. August 25th, Nelson Schaefer, who's here today, retired geologist at IU, will give a program called Building with Beauty about the various uses of geodes, of all things, in construction. September 29th, James Capshew will also come back and give a program, this one on Herman B. Wells, entitled Beyond Being Lucky, Herman B. Wells and Indiana University. Capshew also wrote the book Herman B. Wells, The Promise of the American University. October 27th, Derek Ritchie will return to give a program called The Demolition of the Morton Hunter Mansion and the Birth of the Preservation Movement in 1974. He'll discuss the Hunter and Laboratory mansions and their importance to the city's past. And on November 24th, Christine Friesel has agreed to give another program. This time it's going to be on the Great Depression and its effect on the local area. Correct? Okay, it won't be depressing. It'll be lighthearted, Great Depression stuff. That brings us to today. Duncan Campbell, this is his 3rd trip here, I think. He's made 2 others, I'm sure. His presentation highlights many of Bloomington's notable homes and commercial buildings designed and built by the prolific architect John Nichols. So some of these buildings are still around, and he'll show you some interesting images of those photos that are still here. So Duncan, let's hear about John Nichols, or J.L. Nichols.
I just got an ad on my computer asking me if I wanted to be an Xfinity customer. Hold the mic closer to your mouth. Okay. It won't go away. There we go. I'm not talking. Clay, I got the wrong display. Oh, here we go. Oop. And I haven't even started. I got the wrong display up here, Clay, and I don't know what to do about it. There we go. Thanks for having me back. Didn't know it was going to be the 7th anniversary. That's exciting to be the speaker on the 7th anniversary. I've been coming here, I think, since the beginning. I've spoken a couple of other times. Very briefly, if you don't know me, my background is in historic preservation. I was a carpenter and a contractor for several years before I got into the more professional part of my trade. I came across John Nichols and did a class for Indiana University Lifelong Learning back in the 1990s. And I did a slideshow for that class, and we did a tour, and we managed to get 4, 5, 6 owners of some of Nichols' remaining buildings open so we could do a tour. And it was very popular, and I did it again for them, I think, the next year. And then when Mike asked me if I had something, I thought, well, it'd be fun to do that again. And I went back to my slideshow and realized that it was woefully inadequate because so much more, we know so much more today about John Nichols than we did 25 or so years ago. We still don't know very much. And there is a reason for that. Part of his files and records that were in the Monroe County History Museum have gone missing, including the only copy I ever saw of his album of homes. There is now a Xerox copy of it, so it's not all lost. And of course, many, many, many of his buildings have been torn down. But probably the most devastating event was when his third wife burned all of his files and plans after he died. So we really don't have any written record of him other than what has come through other sources: construction manuals, construction archives, IU archives, some at the History Museum, hearsay, there's a lot of that. So there's been an ongoing, the good side of that is that's created an interest in him, and also created some further research. I don't know if Bill Coulter's here. A shout out to Bill Coulter, who since I did my presentation in the 1990s has done significant research in trying to locate Nichols structures, whether they're still standing or not. And when I did my first look at what was left, I came up with about 22 buildings. I just saw a list that Bill compiled of over 80 buildings, 29 of which are no longer standing that I know of. So I think I can say safely that there are about 51 buildings in Bloomington extant that John Nichols designed and built. He's an extremely interesting character, what little we do know of him. And by the way, I have that list. I didn't make copies of it, but you can get it online. And I didn't put the URLs up or anything, the links up, but if you just Google John Nichols Architect, Bloomington, Indiana, he'll come up. And there are 3 or 4 different sites that have really a lot more information than I knew of just a few years back. So, and you're welcome to look at this list. I made this list. See, Xfinity is after me. We may have to subscribe in order to get them to quit doing that. So I just briefly want to tell you what we do know about his life and his sort of timeline. He was born in Bloomington in 1859 to Hiram and Rebecca, who was a Rogers, Nichols. Hiram was an early Bloomington settler, originally worked as a land surveyor, which of course would have put him in demand in the early days. He becomes a contractor and a builder, and he is actually credited with building a couple of the first IU buildings and when the new campus is constructed in 1880 or so. So he's born to a man who already has construction experience. Let me give you a little bit of context about who's an architect and who's not in 1880. There is no formal architecture school in the United States until about 1875. That's Columbia University, and I think MIT is arguing with them about who is first. But that's basically when the formal school of architecture starts in the U.S. Now, there were, of course, architecture schools in Western Europe, and I'm sure in other parts of the world, the most famous of which is the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris. So if you wanted to be an architect and you lived in Western Europe or in the United States, you pretty much had to go to Paris. And what you learned was classical architecture. And that school still exists, and you can still go there. But if you wanted so-called formal training, which, as we know, lots of people say, my name's Dr. Campbell, but they never went to medical school, right? Or they don't even have a PhD. They just refer to themselves as doctor, like people used to call themselves colonel something or other. Well, architects did the same thing without formal training, but the sort of echelon of proof, or the level at which you had to reach in terms of experience, was still mattered. So in the case of John Nichols, we don't know that he ever went to an architecture school. We're actually pretty sure he didn't. But he called himself an architect, and he was an architect. He was a designer and a builder of buildings, and an extremely good one. His father, a generation earlier, called himself a contractor and a builder. And the name before that would be something like master builder. So the master builder who's building around the time of Thomas Jefferson is the architect of his era. So there's this transition that's happening right as John Nichols comes into the world between the sort of professionalism of architecture and transitioning from the master builder that would probably aptly describe his father. So he grows up in a home where design and construction is on the table all the time, and he works for his father as a young man. He leaves and marries Jeannie Sayre, who is a Bloomington resident, the Sayre family, Sayre Road, I'm sure you've heard of, in 1880, and they end up in Denver in the 1880s, and he works for an architecture firm there as a supervising architecture and as a draftsman. And that is where we think he really got his most professional level training. So, like many of us, goes away to learn his trade and then comes home. We know he was in San Francisco briefly in the 90s. In 1893, there's an enormous depression, the year of the wonderful fair in Chicago, and he is described as sort of scrambling around. He's finding his way. He's looking for work. There really aren't any jobs anywhere. Nobody's building anything. But he ends up in San Francisco working for an architect's office briefly. And then he shows up again in Bloomington, his home, in 1895, and he forms J.L. Nichols Architect, which is his office, his professional office. And that office eventually is located in the First National Bank building on the square, a building that he designed. And as a matter of fact, to give you an idea of the scope of his capacity, he had over 200 draftsmen working for him. This is going to be annoying. At one time, he had over 200 draftsmen working for him. And this is as good a time as any to refer to at least a rumor that came up from, I think it was sourced from his obituary, that said in 1908 he was responsible for the construction of over 600 buildings. That's probably not true. He may have been responsible for the construction of 600 buildings in his lifetime, which is still remarkable. Nevertheless, he was very prolific, as Mike said. So he comes back to Bloomington. He's divorced from his first wife, who apparently fell in love with a Denver man and didn't come home. In 1897, he marries Anna Keeler, and in 1902, he publishes, and I'll show you some of this, Nichols' album of artistic dwellings, which is his sort of famous pamphlet that he would sell to and give to potential clients, which demonstrated his work. And then Anna Keeler, I'm not sure about John's personal life, to be honest with you, because Anna Keeler apparently got in some kind of slander lawsuit with John's mother. And I just imagine what the slander was. I can't. But anyway, that marriage didn't work out. And he ends up in 1903 marrying Maple Dunn from the Dunn family, another settlement family from Bloomington. And they remain married until he dies in 1929. For a brief period of time, he forms another company called Nichols and Son with his own son, whose name is Bridge. And the reason his son is named Bridge, we're just going to get past the personal stuff here real quick, is a great story. When he marries his first wife in Denver, they have their wedding picture taken in a carriage on a bridge. And their son is born shortly afterwards, and so they name their son Bridge. Okay? So to say John Nichols was a little bit eccentric is probably fair. And I think when you see his work, you sort of understand how skilled and talented he really was. And maybe you just have to be a little strange in order to be that accomplished. And then in 1908, that's where the 632 building story comes in. And then for a brief time in 1913, he and his brother Mort, who also worked in the Denver firm, come together and start to work together. But Mort rapidly goes back to Indianapolis, where he's in the retail clothing business, and we don't really attribute much of the work to Mort. Nevertheless, he was an architect as well. And then from 1914 until he dies, John is practicing again as J.L. Nichols architect, and in this office on the square. So this is a cover, a very bad Xerox copy of the cover of the Nichols album of artistic dwellings, which he dedicates appropriately to his father. And I want to just say a few words about it. It's really an interesting thing to read, because in the preface, I know you can't read it, and it's even hard for me to read it on my own screen. But in the preface, what he does is he establishes why beauty is important and why artistic accomplishment and artistic beauty matters to people. And he says, surroundings mold the character and develop the tastes of children. Their mental caliber is soft and flexible. They are easily impressed by their surroundings or what they see. They are quick to detect difference. He's saying, like, hire me to build you a home, and your children will grow up, in good surroundings and be healthy and happy and successful. And he's probably right. So, and he goes on to sort of wax beautifully about the importance of beauty in your life, and says, to feel that your home is artistic, a pleasure to yourself and your children and friends, is to have your hand on the throttle of triumphant bliss. So, there you go. If that's not a sales pitch, I've never heard one. The throttle of triumphant bliss. And then he goes on I'm sorry. I don't know why that won't stop. He goes on in The Modern Home of Moderate Cost to argue for the importance of an architect and to talk about his own years of study, although he doesn't actually tell you what they are, but just that he's spent a lot of time studying the importance of beauty and how to put it into form. And then talks a little bit about the importance of the architect and why you want to avoid cheap work. And interestingly enough, in the time that he was building, the late 19th century and early 20th century, you could build one of his houses for about $3,000. The plans only cost $30. And so, you know, what we think of as, that was obviously pretty pricey in its day, but it doesn't seem very expensive. But he's very concerned that you don't put any value on cheap work, that you appreciate the skill of his trade. And then he has a page that just describes the architect and why the architect is important to the owner and the builder. Say what one will about the artistic in building, the architect must be a firm businessman. The architect is in charge, right? And that, as I talked about the context of building and architecture, the thing that the architect does and establishes for himself, and there's no value judgment here, is he becomes the boss of the job. He runs the job. He's the one who's ultimately responsible. He's going to give you what you are paying for. And it establishes a hierarchy, and he's basically just sharing that with you. And then he has this wonderful page about the contractor, which in the first paragraph says, the contractor is the man who obligates himself to the owner to furnish the material and properly perform it, or as required by the plans and specifications, specified by the specifications as prepared by the architect. In other words, the builder belongs to the architect or works for the architect, and if you don't have an architect there, you're in trouble. And he goes on to talk about why so many contractors are bad guys and why they won't be honest with you and how they can cheat you. And in the last paragraph says, if a contractor tells you that he objects to working from my plans and specifications and under my supervision, and that you don't need an architect, you may rest assured that I have at some time compelled him to live up to his contract, and he has not fully recovered from the shock. Okay, so he's a really delightful guy, obviously. And I have to tell you that I'm not an architect. I am a builder. I have done a lot of architecting and designing on my own. And I've worked for architects and built for architects. And I have to tell you that there is still this uneasiness between builders and architects about who exactly is doing this, And one person appears to be drawing it and devising it, and the other person actually is making it real. And so you can see why there's competition between these things. But Nichols didn't want there to be any doubt about what you need and why you need it. So he is attributed as one of the, if not the originator of something called free classic architecture. This isn't something that you read about in architecture books. It isn't a style that is recognized widely, but it is something that is associated with him. It's also, by the way, associated with other notable architects, most notably Frank Lloyd Wright. Frank Lloyd Wright, remember, is a contemporary of Nichols. They're coming up at the same time. Wright is practicing in Chicago in the 1880s and 90s, steps out on his own at the beginning of the 20th century, and is building lots of homes and commercial buildings at the same time that Nichols is. He outlives Nichols by several years. But I have to say that in looking at this architecture and being in these buildings and just sort of paying more attention to it, even this sort of second go around for me, I'm very, very impressed with Nichols' talent and skill as a designer. So free classic architecture, these are my words, is basically the ability to sort of freely assemble classical motifs in Victorian styles. And so he's a Victorian, right? This is the Victorian era that he's living in. Would somebody just send them a check? And so what Nichols does, and what he's really, really good at, is designing buildings that are original to him. They're not copies. They're not sort of one-off reprints. But he uses all of the popular Victorian styles of the time, as well as the well-known and schooled classical motifs that come out of the primary architecture schools of the time. So he's sort of at, makers, people who make things, design things, invent things, if you will, whether they're architects or not, tend to be able to look in their own time and go a step beyond. So the people who we think of as creative are people who just take it to the next level, right? And it can be anything from fixing your car to designing a house, but he's somebody who is very aware of his own time, of the styles and attributes of architecture of his own time, and he takes it to a different place. He invents a style of architecture kind of all on his own. And that's why I think it's fair to compare him to somebody like Frank Lloyd Wright, who essentially does the same thing. He becomes much more famous and he works for much richer people, but it's a very similar process. So these styles give you an idea of the kinds of things that are his basis. So the neoclassical styles that are the revival styles that come out of Greek and Roman architecture, Western architecture in Greek and Rome. And if you've ever been to Rome, you'll see all of that architecture. And then the sort of later 19th century styles of Romanesque and Richardson Romanesque, which are dependent upon classical motifs, but are quite different and much more American in the sense that they're original to, they originate in this country through other architectural creators. And then the sort of standard Queen Anne style, or standard styles that may or may not be recognizable to you, but are pretty common in the Victorian period, the Queen Anne, the Dutch Colonial, the shingle style and the stick style, and arts and crafts, which is a very large, covers a lot of different kinds of things, including shingle and stick. And then, of course, the bungalow and the advent of the California bungalow and its popularity across the country. And right at the end of his career, he starts to be sort of influenced by Art Deco, and which is kind of coming on the scene at the time of his later life. So what's remarkable about this is that he, with this background and with the knowledge of these styles and their influences, he's able to kind of put them in a bucket and mix them up and come up with something new with them. And if it's I was trying to think of an example that would maybe make you realize how difficult this would actually be. So here's what I came up with. You have 4 dogs. One is a Saint Bernard, one is a Cocker Spaniel, one is a Dachshund, and you can pick whatever the other one is. Make me 1 dog. Okay, that's what he's doing. He's taking these things that are clear and obvious styles, and he's making them into something new, and he's using attributes, the best attributes for the most part, from all of them, sometimes all of them in one building. And he does it on the outside and on the inside. So his trim work, the location, his floor plans, and everything are a conglomeration, if you will, a mix, a blending of all these things. And not only is that a unique thing to do, but all of his buildings are unique from one to the next. So he doesn't come up with a great one and then just build it over and over again. He comes up with several great ones and builds them one at once. So now that I've whet your appetite for some pictures, hopefully, the one I'm going to start with is there's several on the square. And like, as I said earlier, there are about 50 in town, and I haven't, some of the ones that showed up on this list that I haven't gone to see yet, and I don't have pictures of them. What I tried to do was give you enough examples that I can spend an hour with you to doing this, but ones that you would be pretty familiar with already. So I don't have them listed by address particularly or by the name of the family who had them built. They are identified that way, but that really doesn't matter for our purposes. So the First National Bank is a building that he builds. Another building is on this site. It's torn down, and he builds this, what just looks like a kind of standard, of course it's limestone, which is important to all of us, standard sort of office building. And his own studios are professional studios are on the second floor, I believe, of this building for quite a while. And just look a little bit closely at it. This is the entrance of it, and it has fluted pilastered columns here, which are classical attributes. It has a full. Why is that doing that? It has a full. Well, I don't know if I want to go there, but thank you. So very subtle classical attributes. You can see the paired pilasters here on the left and then on the right. Thank you to Bloomington stoplight people for putting two round columns in front of this beautiful entrance so we can't see it. This is what's known as a broken pediment, and the signage guys thought that was cool, so they dropped their sign right in the space that's supposed to accentuate the location of the door. So, it wasn't a very careful assignation there, but if you look at the whole building, look at the cornice, which is what surrounds the top here. This is known as dental work or relieved bracketing, and that's a classical attribute. There seems to be some sort of egg and dart under it, although I can't really see it very well. That's also a classical molding attribute. So these things are just, in this case, embellishments, but you'll see them over and over again in his work. These are what we think of as bay windows. The architectural term is oriel, and these projections. And they help bring light into the building, so they have a practical use, and they're good for ventilation, but they're also architectural features. Here's another one. You'll see them on several of his buildings, and an emphasis on the entry, which is important. This is the Allen Building, which is the location of some apartments. The Allen Building has been an apartment building from its inception. He designed this building as home of the Uptown Cafe, and as we know it. And it's been redone. This is complete fiction here. This was not part of the Nichols. This was an attempt on the part of the current owner to bring it back, but that's actually not what any of the storefront looked like originally. But this facade is Nichols here. Again, oriel windows, the sort of Victorian English Tudor peaks, more bracketing here, several setbacks on the frieze molding. This is all classical attributes. And an interesting use of rusticated limestone, which is this rough split face, against smooth cut limestone, which is an attribute of the Romanesque style, particularly Richardson Romanesque style. And here's again, you can see this is a distorted slide, but it gives you the sense of the sort of hierarchy of the building with the projecting windows. And the KP building, Knights of Pythias, this was the lodge hall in Bloomington, this and Oddfellows, which he also designed, by the way. And obviously the storefront has been altered, and now, of course, it doesn't look like that anymore anyway. And the original windows are not here. The original windows had these diamond crosshatches in the upper sash, which he really liked to use. And again, a kind of a classical frieze, but just an urban building using, again, that sort of juxtaposition of rusticated limestone surface against smooth. And this is actually a brick building with a limestone front. And this was Redmond Lodge and the Knights of Pythias for several years. And Nichols, of course, was a member of every lodge in town. By the way, in his later years, he ran for mayor unsuccessfully on the Republican ticket. And this was when the Republicans were the progressives and the Democrats were not. And here's the entrance to that, what is that technically called the fraternity building, the Knights of Pythias building. Again, an attenuated, a lengthened, made tall, classical form of entrance with a Romanesque arch here and heavy stones over the entrance and these raised pedestals, which actually comes more out of arts and crafts, and then Tuscan columns, and these are pretty close to the true order of Tuscan columns, and a frieze and dental work, all of which come from being well-schooled in classical motifs. And then on Kirkwood, I should say that he built he built dozens of houses that were homes to the wealthier people in Bloomington that lined Kirkwood Avenue from Sample Gates all the way to the courthouse. Now, almost all of those buildings are gone. This was one of them. This was a private home, now known as Kirkwood Manor. And it's been, considerably altered. It's basically a Queen Anne style with the turret and the English sort of Tudor peak. All the windows have been removed and replaced by picture windows, which is, well, I'll let you draw your own conclusions. And then there was a porch, a roof that was a colonnade, if you will, that wrapped the corner of the building at one time, which was removed several years ago. But this building is still here. It's a historically designated building. And again, the rusticated use of limestone on the building. Another little bit more three-quarter shot of it. And you remember, in the early 20th century, these are very ambitious buildings. Most of these are built in the first 10 years of the 20th century. They're very ambitious for their time. And here on the left is the book nook as designed by John Nichols, and then how it is basically not today, but not too long ago. And it, of course, is famous for Hoagie's attendance there and the rallies that the students used to have out in front, and as the gables as well. Another Nichols. Are you getting the idea of how he can do almost anything he wants? I mean, these styles are wildly different from one another, including the McCullough School, which he also designed. And the early part of the 20th century is the era of the progressive movement. So the things that are important to the progressive movement are health and welfare and education, and science is starting to be important. And so buildings start to take on attributes of the progressive era. And one of the things that's very important is access to light and ventilation and for health. And this building was bragged about considerably as a premier example of adapting a public building, a public school, to the benefits of the progressive era and particularly the access to light and air. It's not a totally remarkable building otherwise, but again has a classical entrance. It's a brick building with the tile roof. The chimneys are pretty wonderful, and lots of windows. Of course, that building is still in use. And then, of course, the Von Lee Theater, which he also designed. He did several theaters, not only in Bloomington. And this is an early picture I think from the 60s. It could be the 70s, but the earliest one I could find of the original building, which is built back into what was a house at one time. And then this is the way it looks currently as Noodles. And you can see the back end of the building is pretty much gone now. But Nichols designed that as well. Here it is from across the street, so you can, it's a remnant at this point, but it's nice to have what we do have. And then he didn't build the Princess Theater. The Princess Theater was actually built as one of the Harris theaters originally, but he did do the addition that extended it to 6th Street, the part that collapsed several years ago, you might remember. And he put the terracotta facade on it. So the whole, this whole decorated theater facade of white terracotta and terracotta fruit is his invention. And again, the frieze with dental work on it and this fantastic canopy. I wish I had been in Bloomington when that canopy was on there, that marquee was on there, because I think it's almost unbelievable. It looks almost like a cartoon. By the way, Nichols was a renowned cartoonist, and he did caricatures of people, including himself. And he was also a well-known portrait photographer and had a photography studio. What didn't he do? This is the AME, Bethel AME Church on Roger Street at 7th. And I'll kind of go back and forth here a little bit to show you. This is the south side of it. There's a 3/4 view of it. So I think at first glance, this doesn't seem to be particularly remarkable, but the central arch there that you see is basically a play on the Gothic arch, which is used exclusively or extensively in cathedrals and churches from the Middle Ages, if you will. And it's certainly an architectural reference to that, a much more modern one. In fact, it has that sort of angularity of it as kind of an arts and crafts or Art Deco adaptation of the Gothic arch. So he's sort of playing there without making it too obvious, but still making it important and majestic and as appropriate to a church. And I'm particularly fond of this long side of it where you have the sort of business end of it downstairs, the lower level where the classrooms are and so on, and then the sanctuary level with the upstairs with the stained glass windows. But what I like the best about it is this sort of double tier roof, which brings the building forward here and then stacks up again on top. That's pretty creative and not very commonly seen. And again, a limestone, this time a smooth ashlar limestone. But he's playing with ancient forms here and doing them in a very modern way. Whether you are attracted to it or not is sort of another issue, but there's a lot more going on here from an architectural point of view than is, I think, at first apparent, because it's also quite a modern building in the sense that in a sense of its plainness and free expression of its materials, which, remember, as he is getting to be an older man, modernism is on the rise. So I'll talk a little bit about the houses, which I think are the most interesting and the ones I like the best of his work. This is the Henley house on West 2nd Street. It's basically a 4-square layout, which means that it's 4 rooms up and 4 rooms down, and these houses are all over Bloomington. It's a very standard size and scale residential building, except that he has added a double Romanesque porch to one side, which is, as far as I know, the only one in town. And you can't see it very well, but there's quite a bit of rusticated limestone on the actual railing and the porch. It's quite lovely if the landscaping was out of the way. And I've got a couple of shots of this. There's the porch up a little bit closer. And there are a lot of very subtle things that are going on in this building. This is how it appears in his album. Okay, so the album would show the house itself, so you could show this to the customer, what it's supposed to look like, and then the floor plans as well. And I'm sorry that they're really not more legible, but they're not. So if you look from the side here, you see these here again, the very suppressed oriel window, just barely coming off the face of the house at the front, with this really lightly curved rooflet, if you will. The siding just comes down and forms a drip roof over the window. And you see it again here on the corner as it comes down to this molding rail. That's not easy to build, by the way, that very subtle curve. And one of the descriptions of his architecture was that it was delicate, and I think that's a fair appraisal of those kinds of details. And here again, the back door entry, a closed entry, also under a Roman arch. And then look here, exposed rafter tails on a really large, really wide overhang, which is something that's more likely to be attributed to an arts and crafts style of house. So he likes that detail, so he's added it here. Again, a sort of playful use of a very standard form. And this house is on Prospect Hill on South Rogers. I'm sure you've seen it. It's been recently renovated and painted to display its sort of artistic use of shingles. And this is basically a Queen Anne form with what we easily call Victorian porches. This is with lots of spool work. This is, spool work on the porch, and which is what this is. And then these brackets and turn columns. Pretty standard fare for what we think of as Victorianism. I really like the way that they've painted the building to accentuate the way the shingles have been cut, and it's a little bit tricky to see them, but they're not your standard butt shingle. They're all tapered, and then around the entrance, they're formed to make this little series of arches. It's very creative detail, and this is, I think, what Nichols had in mind when he was telling you not to hire the contractor without the architect, because he was going to bring these kinds of details to make your home artistic and graceful and a good place for your children to be raised. And here's a lovely door with colored glass light around it, which is an attribute of arts and crafts as well. I love the wide stairs. He also delved into the Colonial Revival style, which is, in its plainest form, uses the gambrel roof as its primary architectural attribute. And so here you have a kind of broken gambrel, which is a two-pitch roof under which the second floor falls. But he still has these big projecting dormers that sort of speak to the Queen Anne era. And something he did over and over again, and we'll see more in his houses, is these paired and triplet columns. He really liked to take what would normally be a location for a single column and lighten it and attenuate it, lengthen it, and show the support with much lighter structure. And it makes it much airier. And he was pretty well known for doing this. Again, exposed brackets, which are essentially floor joists coming out here. And these kinds of details, when I was a contractor, we would always say, every time you build another right angle, you add $1,500, okay? Because you don't think about it, But when you have to bring siding into a corner and close it and caulk it and paint it and all the rest of it, you add a lot of labor. These houses have more corners than most people can even imagine. So, and I'll show you on some of the bungalows, it's really extreme. Remember, a lot of these have been remodeled. Some of them have aluminum siding or vinyl siding on them now, and some of the details been hidden. I've tried to show you ones that have kept most of their primary detail. He liked to play with shingles a lot, which is also a Victorian thing, and comes from, guess what, the shingle style, which was a style that accented houses sheathed in shingles from top to bottom. And there you'll see quite a few of them in sort of high style versions of those houses built by McKim, Mead and White, and in sort of fancy resort towns. And the summer homes of the wealthy frequently were done in shingle and stick style. And here another colonial revival take off with this, in this case, with a Queen Anne turret on the corner, with exposed timbering like you would see in sort of the English style, and again the upper floor with real heavy use of shingles, and these lovely divided lights, leaded glass up here with a big cornice over the window. This is an addition, this funny corner back here, so it actually, that roof, what originally was a full gambrel. And again, you see that curved overhang coming down off the siding. And then the bottom, the street view, if you will, the pedestrian view, is all heavy rusticated limestone again. And this is right behind the Kirkwood Manor, which he also designed. That's the back of Kirkwood Manor on Grant Street. Grant Street, yeah. And here's another colonial revival example, again in Prospect Hill. And this time he's turned the gambrel against itself at right angles like a gabled L. You can see the gambrel here. And the exposed bracketing that expressed the second floor. And a planar porch, but nevertheless a turned column that comes all the way through. And this, you can't see this very well, but there's a, I'm not quite sure what the word there is. I'm sure there is a word for this detail, but it's an arch above the window that has a light in it, and then this sort of drop finial that goes out of the top of it. You'll see that on some other buildings as well. And this house, which is over on the east side, which is a frame, really a frame version of a Georgian Central Hall house. And I put it on here because it has some detail that you don't really see, partly because of the way it's painted. Here again is that detail with the finial, with the little window up there. But look, here's the classical pilaster on the corner. Here's the heavy frieze from the Greek Revival, Greek and Roman architecture. And then I think I might have a slide of the entrance. It was so annoying. And here the fan light, the classical entryway with what's called a broken pediment, or it's his take on a broken pediment. It's a little bit different from what you might see. And again, paired columns, very attenuated with capitals, pretty simple squared off rectangular capitals, but again, made light and tall. And it's hard to see, but out here on the corner, this is a sunroom. Again, is a very attenuated pilaster out on the corner, and again around this window. Look at the window detail with the lights above. It's quite. That's a lot of effort for one window on the exterior of the building. And again, it's a what's basically a Georgian form, which is a double pile house. In form, not particularly unique, but a very familiar residential form. And here's another one. This is on a narrow lot. This is on East 8th Street, just off Indiana. And it's turned on the lot so that the sun porch is actually the front facade in this case. And I think, yeah, so here's the front, which you come up to off the corner. And it has a big extended portico on it as well, and a very elaborate set of porch windows. Not anything terribly unique, except that it just sort of, to me, it shows that how familiar he is with these standard forms and how able he is to deal with them in a very elaborate way. This lovely overhang and return with bracketed detail on it. This house is also in the album, I believe. And you can see the porch a little more, and you can see the classical references here, the base and the capital, and the dental work bracketing that goes around the eave. Most of you probably know this house. It's on North Washington Street. This was one of the Showers houses. I believe it's called the Showers Graham House. Redone about 15 years ago. It sort of reminds you of a southern mansion. But you can see here again all the classical references that we've already been talking about. In this case, Ionic, very elaborate Ionic capitals. And these, I don't know if you can see these or not, but these drop finial, these are lights. There's a glass globe on top of, I believe they're iron light fixtures. And he liked to use these divided light upper sash a lot. He did this on the KFP building and on several of his buildings, and you'll see on some of the bungalows. He kind of goes back and forth between that kind of window and the diamond pattern window. That's more usually used on a little bit smaller buildings. Again, just very beautiful, and you notice that he's got triple columns on the corners again. He's sort of gone one extra step to elaborate the front entrance to the house. The bungalows, I think, are maybe my favorite of his buildings because they're very different from each other, and they're fun, I guess I'd like to say. And they have several architectural references that we've already talked about. This one with these attenuated columns that are with these very small yet Ionic classical capitals, and sort of a frequent rhythm of them. The porch is really kind of a half porch because this room extends out onto the porch, and I promise the next time I come, this will never happen again. And this is a pretty complex house. This is now owned by IU. I think the School of Law may own it. This recessed window, this is right out of the shingle style. And again, that sloping roof that comes down, the curve of the roof, it doesn't just come down flat and break onto a shed roof. The whole siding becomes the roof. And the same thing is happening over here. You can see the break in the roof where it starts to create the overhang. That's a complicated framing detail for a relatively inexpensive, well, very inexpensive house. This house would have been built for about $2,000. And here, a side shot, here are the diamond divided windows, and here again are the smaller rectangular divided lights. There's just a lot of detail. If you look up here, the whole facade, the whole front slope of this little dormer is actually slanted back down onto the roof to blend itself into the pitch of the roof. And this is one of the houses I had in mind when I was telling you about $1,500 a corner. Okay, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. Yeah, you do the math. That's complicated stuff, but it's very well articulated. So what that means is when you look at it, you're sort of caught by it. You look again, and maybe you don't know why, but it's appealing to you, which is what he's describing in his album about artistic beauty, really, and how and here it is a little bit from the other side. Again, these very long windows, and look at the roof system. Yeah. So this is in plain sight on 3rd Street, right across from the law school. You can see it anytime you want. It's also in the album, as is its neighboring house. I'll come back in a second, but this is the house immediately to its west, also Nichols bungalow, and it's represented in the album here. It was built for the Meyer family, so it's called in the album. It's called the Meyer Residence, and this is one of the few that has a pretty clear floor plan. The front porch is always referred to as in his language anyway, as the piazza, and this is a central hall, what's known as a receiving hall, a salon on the right, which is kind of the more casual gathering room, and then the family room, and the salon is more like the parlor, so that's where the boyfriend sits while he's waiting for his date to come down. The dining room, chamber means bedroom is another one, and the kitchen in the back. So it's a central hall structure, fairly simple, really. But in the salon, he's got a corner fireplace, and at the end, I will show you a picture of one of his fireplaces just to give you an idea of how elaborate they were. But he was very famous for putting corner fireplaces in rooms, and frequently they're back to back. So rooms that share a wall have corner fireplaces sharing a chimney. But this will sort of give you an idea of an extremely ample layout for a single-story house. And the idea of a receiving hall comes right out of the Victorian era of a sort of formal place, which is really a room. It's not just a hallway. It's not just a place to hang your coat. It's a place where a reception happens, as opposed to the back hall, which is just a route through the building. So this building, similar type of bungalow. You can kind of see the sloping pitch coming through the trees here. I think I have another shot of it. But here again, the triplet columns and a raised rusticated limestone, what's called battered column, because it gets wider as it goes down. And this is right out of arts and crafts language. Yeah, there's a little bit better one of the porch. And this is all covered in aluminum or vinyl now, so it's too bad because there was originally a shingle detail through these places. But it's red brick primarily, and that's all still intact, fortunately. Here you can see the sloping curve of the roof and the sort of rooflets that come out to protect the porch. And I think there's one more, yeah. So look at the treatment of the corners here, where he's woven the bricks together but exposed them in a mortarless situation. I'm getting really good at getting rid of that. Yeah, and then again, this is vinyl now, so it's too bad. I mean, it gives you the idea of how, but this was a big wide frieze, and a lot of it was shingled. And again, that little dormer extension on this house. But yeah, again, just a lot of detail, again, with a completely different material than we've seen before. This is the only one, well, no, I think there might be one other one that's brick that I know of. Entrance is critical, obviously, the welcoming location. And these are two bungalows that are on North Indiana. Not very far north. They're in the vicinity of Dunn Meadow. They're still there. They're very elaborately painted, which sets off their attributes. It's not a great pictures of either one of them. But again, that triplet. Here they're using sort of an Italianate bracket in triples to offset the overhang of the porch. A battered, again, rusticated battered limestone column. And these are sort of true bungalows that shingle style attic window. And here he's used exposed timber and stucco motif with these really large, heavy porch posts that are connected just by basically 6x6 timbers. But there's a lot of thought in this architecture here. A lot of design thought going on here and here. I think he did some of his best work on small houses. And in his album, he actually makes talks about small and inexpensive houses as being just as important as larger and more elaborate houses. And just because they cost less and the people who may buy them are of lesser means doesn't mean that they don't have the right to the same, doesn't mean they don't deserve to have access to beauty and the feeling of artistic semblance, if you will. And I wonder when I look at these if he was really being appreciated by his clients like I'm appreciating him, because when I see these houses, I just pull over, you know. I'm like, wow, look at that. And this is also in Prospect Hill, and this is a simpler version of a house that is referred to as the Nichols house and studio, a house that he actually built for himself and lived in for a while. This is a second one. It's a replica of it, but it's a much simpler form of it, and I'll show you the other one in a minute. It's a central hall building. It's quite small. It has a L off the back, which includes a kitchen and another bedroom, but it's a living room in the middle and a sort of parlor on one end and a bedroom on the other. And then, the house is basically an ellipse. It shows it as pentagonal, if you will, but with flat sides, but it basically forms an ellipse in the floor plan, and you see how the roof imitates it. And I mean, just framing that is a little bit complicated, but there are two of these, and they're still extant, which is kind of remarkable. There's a little bit different view of it. You can see again how the triplet column. And I think you can't see them, but this has diamond pattern windows as well. And this is the Nichols home and studio. I'll show you 2 or 3 pictures of it. This is where he lived. This is on North College, just south of the railroad overpass as you come north into town on College. And it's hard to see it. When you go into the underpass, if you look quickly to your left, you'll see it. It's remarkable because of its geode porch, and apparently there's a chimney that had geodes on it too, but some of those are missing. The same basic roof, but see how it comes down and then changes pitch on this house? A little bit more elaborate than the other one. Much more elaborate windows. Again, a triplet column, but built up on this very heavy porch wall. And this, I think there's another one. This is his studio, which is a kind of an imitation of a barn. Lots of shingle, and here's this swag, inverted swag up here with shaped from shingles as well. And this house, he was very proud of his interiors, and even in simple, less expensive houses, he did very elaborate fireplaces, lots of arts and crafts tile of different colors and finishes, in all different kinds of arrangements, lots of quarter sawn oak with classical detail around the fireplaces, and then the mixed use of hardwoods. In this house, there's a cherry floor, hardwood floor, there's walnut trim, and oak fireplaces. And it's all together, which a lot of people wouldn't try to do just because it's too risky to pull it off. You have to be able to design those things together. And here it is in the album, and there's some really sort of nice narrative about him included here. but this is copied from the album. But there you can see the floor plan pretty well. I think I might, here it is, but here's a better view of it. Here it is in the album, and here's the floor plan. So that's the front piazza, this chamber, bedroom, and living room, and dining room, and then the kitchen and sort of business end, the bathroom in the back. And these houses have cellars in them too, full cellars in them. So there is room downstairs and and then a back porch as well. So it's a little bit bigger than you think. Yeah, so here you can see the studio a little bit better. And this is his take on basically a barn or a shed. It's mostly original. It has this little detail on a barn is called a hay hood, and this is the hay door, right? So you bring your hay in on the wagon and you drop your hook and you pull it up and you put hay in the loft. Well, in this case, it's a studio, it's his workshop. So it never had any intention to be a barn, but it's built as a rural reference to that kind of building. And these lovely returns that become the extended roof that go back along the side. Pretty imaginative stuff. This little pent roof, I believe, is added, but this is a law office now. I think this is actually a rental residence. And then just to give you a little bit of an idea, he not only designed houses, but he designed all the casework for that's the inside. So the baseboards, the chair rails, the window and door trim, the fireplaces, and here for this particular structure is all the case detail, exactly how he wants all this built. A step back cupboard and its location, the fireplace, the paneling. This is the kitchen cabinets over the kitchen sink. This is the detail for the baseboard and so on. The molding details, all sketched in the plans that you would purchase. And here's the fireplace for that house. And this is very typical. This is one of the corner fireplaces. I'm sorry, I really need a show of just his fireplaces. I need to go back to all these houses and take pictures because they're really beautiful. He uses all different kinds of tile in the arts and crafts mode. Frequently the hearth is tile. They usually have an iron surround so that they could be used to burn coal, of course. And then, a classical referenced wood. This is quarter sawn oak. You can't really see it very well. This is a curved mantle with dental work on it, and then these Italianate brackets that get bigger and longer as they come out into the room. And that's pretty imaginative stuff, and people say, well, people were doing this all the time, but they weren't. They were doing it, but they weren't doing it like this. And again, this sort of elongated column, if you will, with the classical capital and the swag detail. These are applied carvings. And that's the cherry floor and the walnut trim. That's the only one I could find that I had that was really a good image. So I wanted you to at least get a peek at what he did. So John Nichols, he's our own Frank Lloyd Wright, if you will, for Bloomington, and we really need to be proud of him because he's really a unique designer, and his buildings are treasures. Most of them. I won't say every one of them, but we have lost well over half of them that we had, and there have been efforts to try to designate some of them, and I've been trying to get the agreement of this Preservation Commission to do them all, and just do them as a multiple listing, and just get them all protected, because there are now about 50 of them, which seems excessive maybe, but we're losing some as we speak. So, and maybe next time I will have managed to get back into the interior of all of these, and we'll do a show on just the interiors because they're really, really beautiful. And Some of them are missing, of course, but lots of them are still there. Thank you.
Duncan?
Yeah.
That was one of the most fascinating programs we've had, in my opinion. Did the people
By the way, would you be interested in joining Xfinity? Sorry.
Did the owners that he worked for have much input into what went into houses?
You know-
I get the idea that he was kind of like Frank Lloyd Wright.
You-
He told
you-
people what he was going to do, and he just did it.
If we had his papers, we'd know a lot more. But because of this album, and when you look at the album, there are I don't know how many houses are in it, maybe 30 or 40 different designs. They're very different, and they're very unique. So my guess is probably they didn't have a lot of input. They went through the album and picked one. And they might make it a little bigger or a little smaller or something like that. But the detail is so great that I can't imagine a client getting that engaged in, well, how exactly are we going to do this fireplace? I think these were pretty much one-off designs. Yeah.
The residence there on North Collinsville,
I think it's 1900.
it predated the railroad.
Yes, and he lived there for 2 years and sold it to the railroad when it came in. And then they didn't do anything with it. A railroad worker lived in it for several years, and then they just sort of abandoned it, and it deteriorated very badly. And then they were persuaded to sell it, and now it's been restored. Yeah.
Duncan, would he be considered the premier architect of his era, or were there other rivals in Bloomington at the time?
Well, there are other buildings built by well-known architects, primarily seated in Indianapolis. I can't remember, I think his name was Foley, who did several Indiana University buildings. Nichols did a couple of rebuilds on university buildings that are right there on the oldest part of the campus. And he did some additions. He built the power plant number 3, which burned at some period. And if you look at the list, I mean, the variety of buildings, commercial as well as residential. Several of the houses on Dunn Meadow on the north side of 7th Street, there are some Mediterranean plans, 1 or 2 in there. Those are his. And yeah, they're all over. And there's some very simple, I have some slides of some very simple gabled L houses like you might see on West 6th Street or West 7th Street or something.
But you would consider him the premier?
There isn't anyone who has emerged as being anywhere near this productive or as unique. And the free classic style is not something that just went everywhere, but it is something that he pretty much laid claim to. Yeah.
I was intrigued by East 8th Street building that you showed. On each side of the chimney, there's sort of a triangular, but windows
Yeah.
that you didn't mention.
No, I didn't. But I'm trying to teach you to see those things for yourself. Yeah, those are then it's very clever because those things let light into spaces that normally don't have it. So a rear hallway or a corner or a transition from one room to the other. And remember, electricity was a budding, experience. And so you might have a light in 3 or 4 of your rooms, and you may have an outlet here and there, but that was about it. So windows were really, really important. Yeah.
Was he disappointed when the railroad brought the tracks that are right next to his house?
I would have been. I mean, can you imagine? That's his home.
It was a decent neighborhood, and they plowed that railroad through there in 1906, so it had to have driven a lot of people's expectations.
Yeah, and he built the house just a few years before, so.
I wonder, there was a rash of building very nice residential buildings out of Indiana limestone in New York, City, another one. Did he have any role in promoting the limestone?
Not that I know of, and again, we really don't know very much about the guy, I should say that for additional context, there is an enormous building boom going on in the United States at the time of his career, and particularly here. this is the height of the limestone industry. As you know, from one of the lectures I did before on the history of the limestone industry, this is when everything is really, they never return to the kind of production that they were doing from 1895 through and up until 1925, up until really the Depression. And there's a huge building boom. So there's a lot of demand and there's a lot of wealth. And so he's partaking of that. And he, right place at the right time. But remember, he's a Bloomington native. He basically spent all but 5 years of his life right here. Yeah.
Great program. I really, really enjoyed it. Thank you. Have you considered or have you done walking tours of the?
I have, yeah. And the thing I did for lifelong learning, that was part of it. We couldn't get into all of the buildings, so we walked some of them, but we got into, I can't remember now, 4 or 6 of them. Yeah. And Bloomington Restorations has done at least one Nichols tour I know of, not for a long time. But now there's, and again, Bill Coulter has done a lot of work researching, finding other avenues to Nichols' work that I didn't know about. And so we're starting to, now that I've become more familiar with his stuff, I'm going to get back on foot and walk around.
I would like to know. So.
Eric.
Nichols designed the IC station next to his studio building, and second question, connection to the Ed Brook firm was interesting. Willoughby Ed Brook is the brother of the guy he worked for. He was this architect of the Treasury, designed government buildings across America. Do we know anything more about that?
I don't, only that he basically apprenticed and he was a draftsman and he became a so-called supervising architect, which I assume meant that he was on the job site. And that was kind of his schooling away from home, I guess. But no, I don't know. That's the first I've heard about that firm. I didn't know anything about them. I don't think he did the train station. At least it doesn't show up in any of the lists. But it's pretty eclectic on its own. But train stations kind of tended to be. So yeah, I don't know. Yeah.
Was the triple columns his signature, or do you find that in other areas?
No, you see it in other places, and you see it some in classical references. So it's not, he didn't make that up, but he really liked it. And if you have a small structure, especially, and a fairly lightweight one, a great big column doesn't really work. And if you have a big fluted thing and you make it too small, it just seems out of place. But several small ones are easy to kind of keep it light. That's what I think they do, and they. Well, the Greeks and the Romans have sort of two different periods of the Romans get it from the Greeks and then they elaborate on it considerably, and we're talking about hundreds of years of development, and then it gets spread into the sort of Northern Europeans discover Rome and go there, and all their architects go there and study and do sketches, and books start to be published, and that classicism spreads and becomes the kind of formal architecture. And this is also in the midst, he's growing up in the midst of the City Beautiful movement, which is started in 1893 by the Columbian Exposition in Chicago, and which accentuates and emphasizes classicism. And so he's in the midst of all these cities tearing out their slums and building new, beautiful civic buildings. Our courthouse is one of them, right? So the same idea. So he's seeing all this happening around him, and he's sort of in the mix of it at the same time. So I find it interesting that his take was so complex, if you will. Yeah.
When a house gets historical designation, how much of the house is protected by that?
The exterior, and the lot.
Not the fireplace and not the floor.
No. Although, well, I mean, it happens that buildings get gutted. IU is, and I'm not an IU hater, but when IU goes in and makes an office out of a bungalow, stuff happens. Drop ceilings go in, fluorescent lighting, but they're like on that red brick bungalow. They've been pretty careful not to obscure the obvious beauty of the building. and they haven't torn it down, right? Those are prime locations right there, and they've seen fit to protect those buildings, so, yeah.
Those two buildings, they're right beside the parking garage on 3rd Street. So
Yeah.
they're like, the parking garage goes right up behind it.
Yeah.
And I encourage people to go there and walk around those buildings. They've got amazing detail. And IU doesn't seem to map behind it.
No.
You wander around in the yard and get up close so you can always see the detail on the railings of the ones and the woven brick corners are really.
Yeah, the closer you get, the better it is, yeah.
Really cool.
Yeah. Somebody else over here? Anyone else? I encourage you, if you're interested in this, to just Google them, you know, I hate to say that, but somehow it just seems silly to say that. But the list of his known buildings is there, and when I went through it, they even say whether they're still there or not, and they give the addresses of them, and the name of them, and they're mostly named after whoever bought them, you know, the family name. And you can do your own walking tour. I mean, most of them are concentrated from Walnut east to the university and north of Kirkwood. So that's not a very big walk, you know. And Prospect Hill has about 5, and there are some on South Grant, South Lincoln, so some of the smaller. It's hard to miss them now that you know what they look like. You'll see them. And so now when we walk around, it's like, I wonder if Nichols built that one, you know, because there's just so many telltales about his style. Yeah. All right, thank you.